what is process-driven approach for good architecture? Well, fundamentally, I'm here to tell you that we need a new approach to analyzing, designing, and building our Salesforce orgs and systems in general. And you might be thinking, well, why do we need a new approach? What's wrong with the current approach? Well, the short answer is, as part of my job at our company, we're looking at a lot of orgs, and we've recently done a study of 100 different production orgs. We looked at their health, their configuration, and most importantly, the efficiency of their development efforts. And what we found was that over 50% of newly built custom objects never get used. That wasn't a joke, but go ahead and laugh. I want to quickly just pause here for a second and explain that number. It is not, of all the objects ever created in the history of this 20-year-old org, 50% are no longer used. No, it is of the stuff that you built over the last 12 months and deployed to production, how much of this stuff was used at all, as in more than 0 records, and half never were. And that doesn't include standard objects. That doesn't include the managed package objects, when you click a button and now you have 1,000 of those. No, that's not. We really wanted to focus on the stuff that you had to put some effort in. Have a session, answer an email, have a workshop, have another workshop, then talk to the person who wasn't included in the workshop, then design, then build, that stuff, right? 50% built in the last year wasn't used. On a kind of related topic, you all probably remember these could you just build me this field requests? A lot of you nodding, like the salesperson comes, I really need this thing on account. Yeah, well, turns out in the same fashion, over 40% of custom fields we put into our system on the request of, not singling you out, Toby, salespeople or other people in the business, never get filled out at all. And if you want to learn more, because we have a whole report on this, we did with Jody Herbeck and Vanessa Grant, there are more insights in there. Even if you account for checkboxes and all these other fields that technically can be left blank, and that's still an acceptable answer, even if you account for all of that, it's still high 30% of fields you build never get filled out at all. So that's why I say, I'm sitting here and saying, we do need a new approach to building and designing our Salesforce orgs, because that level of waste, well, personally, it's, I talk to a lot of developers, a lot of admins, a lot of architects. Whenever they see that number, they feel a bit like, you mean all of that effort, all of those hours, sometimes weekends, all the nerves, all the arguments, it wasn't really worth it even, half the time. That's a bit, that hits morale. And then think about the impact on the business. There's a term that one of my mentors has coined about technical debt. The technical debt in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's about the interest rate you pay on it. Like if you have a credit card and it has 20 or 30% interest rate, you better pay that very quickly. Something that has a 0% interest rate, it's not gonna become any worse next month. If every year 30 to 50% of stuff we build doesn't get used, think about an interest rate on your org complexity that is. Every year after year, we keep adding more and more stuff that doesn't get used, which makes interfaces more complex, which means people in sales or marketing or other business functions cannot even find the information they're looking for, so they have more requests, and on and on and on we go in this endless cycle. So, on that positive note, how can we address it, and how does the process-driven approach to architecture help us address this problem? A lot of the times, the reason why we keep building a lot of stuff that doesn't end up being used is because, for better or for worse, we have this guy. let's start coding and we'll figure out what they want later. That's not necessarily how we all operate. That's not the intent of how we want to operate. But the reality is that's often how it is, especially in organizations when there isn't a documented business process or a documented ways of working. We usually rely on a couple of individuals, the most vocal individuals, to say what they need and whether what they want is how their team works or whether that's, it's usually becomes very difficult to build solution for the many and not for the few. Upfront process mapping allows us to understand true requirements and full requirements and complete requirements for a given solution. It also helps us standardize processes, and if we have good understanding of the standardized approach, then it's that much easier for us to actually build and automate something on top of it. And most importantly for me, it actually gives us opportunity to truly innovate. One of the things I hope to convince you of is that innovation, especially on Salesforce, it doesn't even require that much creativity. It doesn't even require that much experience. It helps, but what I'm here to try to convince you of is you can actually learn to innovate and find solutions that your stakeholders didn't even ask you or didn't even think about that would impact and improve their user experience if you just have a good approach to analysis that anyone can learn. So, what's the approach? Just FYI, I should have started at the beginning. I'm a bit of an evangelist for universal process notation. That's the polite way of saying it. A true way of saying it is I'm kind of a what's the word I'm looking for, Richard? Yes, thank you. Thank you. A bit of a cult leader on universal process notation. And I will be accepting donations at the end. Why is it? A lot of the times, and I'm happy to have very heated conversations afterwards with anyone, when we approach process mapping activity, trying to capture the business process, I'll actually hide that for a second because we'll read that in a sec, we do flowcharts or we do some other types of diagrams, and they're great a lot of the time, but flowcharts and BPMN, if you're really, really advanced in this, were primarily built to help visualize in a human form algorithms. They were not really originally built or designed to communicate to humans. UPN is a methodology that is now endorsed, among others, by Salesforce. It's a big part of the business analysis certification. And one of the key things is that the entire notation is right here on the screen. To give you a comparison, who here is familiar and knows business process management notation? Yeah, I have a few hands up. The official manual for that is 536 pages. So you might be the very few people in the world who actually are very fluent in this extremely complex notation. In comparison, that's extremely simple. And while it feels simple because it's just one shape, and the idea is there should be no cognitive effort being put either by you or by your stakeholders reading it into what does each shape mean and what does each color represent. It actually puts a lot of effort and emphasis on what you actually put in and around the shapes. So there's only one shape, but what you put in it is what matters. Verb-based activity, what happens? Input, when does it happen, or what triggers the activity to happen in the first place? Why are we doing the thing in the first place? That has its roots in lean management. Like, are we doing it for the sake of doing it, or is it actually we're gaining something as a result? Who does that and with what? In its simplest form, if you have a UPN diagram, obviously that's just a simplification, it would be something like this. Bunch of shapes, the same shape over and over and over again. with all this information captured in a single flow. There's another aspect of UPN notation, and I'll give you some practical examples of that in a moment. UPN stands for Universal Process Notation, and the principle there is it's supposed to be readable and understandable by everyone. And one of the ideas here is each diagram should be fairly simple, fairly small, readable, not too complex. But there is complexity in this world. How do we deal with complex scenarios? How do we deal with detail? The idea is you actually capture the detail as a child diagram. So UPN is in its nature a hierarchical diagramming notation, very similar, by the way, to the Salesforce diagramming notation for architecture diagrams. It's all very abstract, but it all makes sense in a minute when I'll give you a practical example. Now, before I move on to showing you how this works in practice and how, most importantly, this approach helps inform good architectural decisions and helps us spot opportunities for innovation, I do want to say one thing. It's all about the outcomes. One of the things that people often struggle with when they move from flow charting or BPMN to UPN is actually that, well, I'll just help myself. It's just this little line over here. That's where all the complexity lies for most people. Because we've all been taught over many, many years that when you're flow charting, for instance, you go send quote, and the outcome is quote is sent. This is what I would call a circular logic. And if you capture things like that, you never actually discover, A, why are we doing the activity in the first place? What's the value of it? And if it's not valuable, we shouldn't be doing it. And more importantly, every activity must lead to a clear, distinct, verifiable set of conditions. I'll give you an example. Let's say you have an activity which says create a case created. Okay? If it's said, however, that a case is logged in Salesforce with summary, let's say description, linked contact, and we say these are the 3 essential pieces of information that we need to have for a case to be considered worth a damn. Well, that is verifiable. That is distinct. That is something we can actually check in the system. More importantly, we now know, just by making it slightly more distinct, that maybe we need a validation rule. Maybe we need to make these fields required on creation, or whatever. So that already informs how we might think about the solution. If we just went create a case created, that tells us nothing. That tells you nothing. It's very unspecific. If you want to take a quick screenshot, there's a quick cheat sheet. I can also give you the access to it later if you want to connect with me. But let's get maybe to, just in interest of time, to the case study, because it's all nice in theory, and I make some very grandiose claims in here. And I also have a feeling there are more people in this room. I'm very humbled. Case study. So this is something that, together with Miriam McCabe, who's the head of innovation design at Salesforce, we've kind of designed as an example over a year ago. And I think it was first presented at Paris Dreaming last year. We came up with a theoretical example based on our kind of journey experiences of a recruitment process for a recruitment agency. And let's quickly just go through this process so you understand. Let's go through a couple of those. A need to fill a vacancy, the business arises. Customer needs to initiate this recruitment and contact the recruiter. What's the outcome? Role details need to be shared with the recruiter. Recruiter then needs to make sure the job spec is fit for the market, but it needs to be finalized and approved by the customer. The recruiter then searches for suitable candidates who are then added and associated with the role. We then engage with those candidates, and either they express no interest in the role, or they express interest in the role, at which point we perform some further interviews with submitted candidates, and if they agree to enter into employment, we obviously then collect the fee for our services. And that's a nice high-level diagram, but obviously everyone can make you, there's so much more that's going on in recruitment. Yes, it does. And that's why, in a UPN format, we can drill down into a child diagram and go, okay, so what happens within initiate recruitment for a vacancy? Customer reaches out with an email, most likely, to us, their recruiter, the agency, usually tells us something about the job spec. We inquire about some additional details, and then we have those details, we log them in some system. Could be Salesforce, for instance. And on we go. I don't want to unless you really want to go through the entire process end to end. The idea here is that at any given moment, we're trying to limit cognitive effort both on us and on a stakeholder. We're starting with a high level. And then let's focus on this specific process. How does the vacancy even get initiated? And only once we feel like we've completed that story, that diagram, do we move on to another session. That also helps us to potentially, if we need to do a process discovery workshop, it makes it easier to set the agenda. Trying to map out this entire process in one hour session, for instance, with a customer, very unlikely. However, if we, let's say capture the top level, the high level, and then we decide, okay, we need more detail here, here, and here, that already lends itself to a very specific, what's going to be our agenda for the next session and the next session. It gives us very clear, we're going to start here, and the end point is going to be, let's say, hand over to our recruiter. So it makes it very, very easy to stay on the message, if you will. Okay. So let's now talk about the architecture, because at the end of, the title of the session is, what is the title of the session? Oh, right. Process-driven architecture is the theme. So where's the architecture? So far, we've talked a lot about the process, the mapping, why flowcharts are not good, and why UPN is the best, and all that good stuff. But how about the architecture? How about the actual solutioning? So I'm going to show you how, if you capture enough detail in your business processes, then questions around the architecture, automations, integrations, and even security are very easy to infer from what you captured. So let's start with, how can you derive the data model from the process? We've got this diagram. Well, just pay attention to nouns and resources. Vacancy, recruitment, customer, role, interview, payment, job spec, candidates. You can just really read the text and just pick those nouns. And these are, especially if we're building a completely new solution. If we're talking about building a logical ERD model, these are your entities. And now you don't have to try to figure out, have we missed any entities? There's something we've missed. Everything is in the process. Everything we need, everything we deal with logically has been already captured. We just need to figure out how it all fits together. The process doesn't necessarily answer that for us. That's where you need the architect's mind to answer these questions. But at least all the entities that we might need to perform this process are already there. We just need to pick them. By the way, I'm not saying this is the right ERD. Actually, me and Miriam is the one part of our presentation that we always disagreed on. The point is, you still need to do your architecture work here. Okay, so that's the ERD. How about finding the integration points in the process? Surely that's too bold of a claim to be true. Well, again, it's all about capturing systematic, detailed information. When I showed you the notation slide, If you capture the systems that are being used, remember, who does what with what, right? That's what the resources are for on a UPN notation. Who is responsible for executing this, and what tools or systems they're using to do that? Well, we have information about, in some ways, what systems are being used by people to execute a given process. If we go through all these diagrams, the entire hierarchy of diagrams, we will have a whole list of systems that are involved. We will also figure out where we don't even know what systems might be used, and that's in there an opportunity for conversation or suggestion of some solution. And for instance, if you create a simple table of, around each activity, what system is being used, and the next activity after that, what system is it pointing to? Well, we can start thinking, okay, so we have a couple of activities where there is no system at all. And then we have a couple of email-to-email kind of interactions. Whenever you see email-to-email or no system, that's obviously potentially an opportunity for us to, hey, how about we have a portal? How about we use Salesforce for that? You can fill out some of these gaps and figure out where you might put some integrations into to help out. In this diagram earlier, for instance, let me just zoom in very quickly. Even there, activity 2, you're in Salesforce. Activity 3, you're in LinkedIn. Activity 4, you're in Salesforce again. Okay, well, that works manually. Could we automate that? Does a person even need to leave the Salesforce or the system they're in? How about finding opportunities for automation? So this is the area which I kind of described as the innovative bit, or finding opportunities for innovation. So pay attention to verbs. With entities and entity relationship diagrams, we were focused on nouns. But with automations, it's all about the verbs. So we have search through the internal candidate database. Let's pause that. We have a verb. Well, every activity needs to be a verb. Keywords, review job spec. Sorry, activity number 1, not 2. Review job spec, and you have identified keywords that you'll be looking for against that job spec. Okay, where are they captured? And if so, how? How do you search for the database? How many candidate records are there? How is the search going to work? Is it a free text, choose search? What this shows is it's very easy to capture, let's say, the high-level business process, but the key about UPN is always trying to ask what, who, with what, when, why, and how. So as we're going through these boxes, we can ask, how is activity 1 performed? How is activity 2 performed? And if we realize that there is clearly a very manual activity going on here, we should be thinking, okay, can we automate this? Is there an opportunity for us to make it easier? Chances are, and what I found over the years, is that we will be mapping out the business process. We will do a process discovery workshop, and people will say, yeah, so we search for Salesforce or from some other database, and that's what we do. And then you pause and so how's that working out for you? Oh yeah, we hate it. It's very easy when you're in a mindset of trying to capture the business process to just accept things as they are. But if you stop and actually question, okay, so how do you do that? And does it work for you? And is it efficient? And all of that, you will discover that a lot of the time, people really hate the tools that they're using and how they're working. And that's the opportunity for you to come in and think, okay, so why don't we fix that? Interestingly, you can even start some early automation design here. If you have a recruitment agency, job specs being uploaded, you have candidate CVs, that's plenty of text you need to go through. I would argue that this is probably a prime example of where using any sort of AI tool, vector database, all these modern tools But by the way, Salesforce now provides or is about to provide, because I'm not sure whether the vector database thing is GA yet, but it's coming if not. You can now go, hey, this is a prime use case where we could use a tool like that to make this so much simpler for you. And the part where, and the reason I put the smiley face or the laughing face is, I remember when I tried to convince Miriam that you can also use a process diagram to infer required permissions, and she laughed. She said, nah, that's usually not how it works. But actually, let's pay attention to verbs and handoffs. The nature of the verb itself can inform on the CRUD requirements. So, for instance, add new candidate to the database. What permissions does the recruiter or person, let's say, in that role need to have on whatever object is being used in Salesforce? Well, clearly create. It's clues in the name there. They also probably need to read it and update it. And it is, the reason I mentioned is there's the report, and I will give you a QR code at the end as well, that we did recently around how much stuff that we build ends up not being used. As our previous report, we're just about to launch a new report where we look into complexity of permissions and profiles and in Salesforce orgs. And spoiler alert, it's not good. There is a tendency, to, as we've seen across many orgs, for there to be, on account objects, on average, 62 profiles and permission sets that you need to consider if someone needs to have access to account. And 70% of those give the exact same permission as every other. So clearly we have an issue in our hands. The most common permission given to users on every object is everything. Modify all, create all, go nuts, on accounts, on contacts, on leads, you name it, go for it. That's the most common security setting given to users across most orgs. So we don't necessarily, and historically it seems like we haven't really given too much thought into what precise permissions are needed to perform the job, usually because we don't have a standardized, documented process that we're trying to support. So in some ways it's understandable. Let's give them all the access. That way, if they come up with a use case they haven't told us about, at least we support it. On the other hand, that makes our orgs extremely insecure, and it definitely violates the minimum access security policy that we should all be applying. Yeah, so if you think about going through your activities in the process, update job spec, approach network of candidates, add new candidates. I like the approach specifically. If there's a particular person in the business, a recruiter that needs to, let's say, be able to find and then, candidates, then if that's the only thing they need to do, they just need to be able to read the object. They don't necessarily need to add more detail. So what have we learned? If we perform a detailed analysis and documentation of the business process, we can actually very easily understand the entities, actions required on the entities, CRUD requirements, scope of actions that systems need to perform. If we drill down to more detail, we can even figure out sometimes even field level security, design integrations, and so on and so on. The point I'm trying to make is, in a very detailed diagram, the architecture, the solutions you need are almost, I don't want to say given to you on the platter because that is insulting to architects. That's not really the case, but it takes away a lot of the guesswork. It points you at the business requirements of the solution much more clearly, and makes the job of an architect that much easier. If you want, that's the QR code to the report from the beginning, where we showed how much stuff being built on Salesforce doesn't end up being used. Even if you're not interested in this particular report, every 2-3 months we publish a new report. As I said, there's one on permissions coming out probably this month, and there's one on org complexity and as it accumulates over time, probably later. So watch that space. There's definitely a lot of great quantitative data-backed insights that you might find very, very valuable. All right, so that's me. Let's do Q&A and thank you. Thank you. Yes, are there any questions I can answer? Yes, good sir. Sure, I have plenty of opinions. On this, but oh, in that case, no. Next question. No, in all seriousness, business process mapping, or if we were to use slightly less specific term, business analysis or understanding of business requirements, to me sits as a responsibility of the product management function, or business analysis function, if we're talking about internal system management. That's where the ultimate responsibility lies. I've now talking to a lot of companies that, there are companies where there are architects who do a lot of business analysis. I don't particularly like the term Salesforce admin because every Salesforce admin I meet seems to be a one-man or woman band of doing kind of BA, architect, dev at times. But it is ultimately a product management / business analysis, business analyst responsibility. We do use it with our own team. I have one of our product managers here. We have a big team of developers as well. We use it with our developers. We usually debate things against those diagrams. We show them kind of the user experience and why the solution needs to do that and not something else. So we have with our customer success teams or sales teams, we go through those as well. So the stakeholders are in almost every department, but if you're asking who actually runs this, who owns this, I would say product managers or business analysts, depending on how you call it. Oh, it's going to be a tough one. Hey, Nils.
What would be your advice? It's really hard to get into the methodology, even if it's very simple.
Mm-hmm.
What's a good starting point for people coming into it?
That's a very good question. You need a guide, is probably the shortest answer. I would say you need to find, and there are both companies and in terms of training and products out there that have materials that can help you guide through that mental shift. That Clicked has done a bunch of courses on UPN, and they do cohorts every couple of months. At our company, we have some UPN experts that usually help people with getting up to speed with the methodology. But it is a mental shift. You're right. Even though the methodology is simple, I find that probably you'll agree it's usually the outcomes. I don't want to put Nils on the spot, but him and his team have actually done a lot of UPNing in their company. If you'd like to maybe learn from the master on how they did it in practice, he might have a few tips as well.
I have one more.
Yeah, go ahead.
What about repeating processes which are used in many different areas of the overall process landscape? So things like sending out an email, which is a process on its own on a sub-level, but you have to reference it from many different directions. How would you do this in that hierarchical structure?
Very good question. So first thing worth saying is in order to use UPN correctly, you do need to have a drawing tool that supports UPN notation. It is not necessarily you pick up draw.io and get started. You can, to a degree, try to hack it together, but especially the hierarchical aspect of easily creating child diagrams, that's an aspect where you usually need a tool that actually supports UPN methodology out of the box. And there are a couple out there that you might want to check. Specifically to answer your question, in our tool, which obviously supports UPN, there is a feature coming, what we have, 19th of July. So there's a feature coming by the end of July where when you focus on the box, you can either go, I want to create a new child diagram here, or I want to link back to an already existing diagram. So when it goes live, and I'll let you know personally, that's what I would use, because then as you have different business, creating a case is a great example. You have your salespeople doing their opportunity process, and then you have customer success managers doing their account management process. You've got marketing, who I actually don't know what they do, but they have their own processes. And at any given point, they might, sorry, I'm just kidding, log a case or some other information. And how do you capture that without having to redraw the same diagram over and over and over again? Well, if you have a sophisticated UPN tool, you can just draw it once and then reference it many, many times when needed.